Hello everyone, and welcome to my currently freezing garage. There's literally a winter storm coming on the way, but this is the only place I can film in the whole house, so welcome back. I hope you're doing well, staying warm. Today's video is a sequel to my other video on malazan, which was titled Malazan First Impressions, Expectations versus Reality. In that video, I went through a bunch of expectations that I had for the series and whether or not the first book, Gardens of the Moon, lived up to those expectations or how my actual experience was different. In today's video, we're going to be revisiting those expectations, but this time I've read DEADHOUSE GATES as well. So we'll see whether or not my opinions have changed. Some definitely have, and others have stayed the same. The first part will be spoiler-free, completely spoiler-free for Gardens of the Moon and DEADHOUSE GATES, so if you haven't read any malazan, you can keep watching, but I will have a short spoilery section at the end where I will predict what I think the next book is going to be like and how certain character arcs are going to end up. Thank you so much for tuning into my channel as always. So in my last video, my first expectation had been that malazan would be really hard to read, and specifically with the second book, I think that it's actually a lot easier to read than Gardens of the Moon. I think part of it is that by the second book, you're used to Steven Erikson's writing style, so knowing what to expect naturally made DEADHOUSE GATES a lot easier to read. I also think that on a micro sentence-to-sentence level, Gardens of the Moon was obviously a beautiful book. As a whole, I think DEADHOUSE GATES is much better constructed, and the pacing throughout is much more even. That also contributes to it being a lot easier to read and just easier to get into. I think with the first book, there was a bit of a downtime where I wasn't really sure where the plot was going or what was going on, and that is true to an extent with DEADHOUSE GATES, but I think that overall it was just immediately compelling, whereas with Gardens of the Moon, there was a bit of a period where I wasn't sure whether or not I was fully invested. There's a lot of stuff that happens in this book that's not immediately explained, but I think that the point of those scenes is that even the characters themselves don't know what's happening or why it's happening, and that's not really unique to malazan. I think a lot of series do that, where the author will introduce some sort of wild card and the characters don't know what's going on. And, obviously the thing is that you'll either find out or it's meant to be sort of a mysterious aspect of the world. And while I will say that, malazan does it a lot more than the average series, I don't think it's particularly unique or it's the only series that does that. That's part of the reason why a lot of people like to characterize reading malazan as super hard and complicated. But I want to push back on that notion again, because I think that it just creates this sort of gatekeepery elitist attitude around a series, and at the end of the day it only harms the community, because when people ask about malazan or they snoop around, all they see is oh my god, the series is so complicated and hard to read, and so a lot of people just never end up picking it up because it's already so long, and so adding the caveat on top of it that it's hard to read is just pushing readers away. I said this in my last video, but if you want to read malazan, go for it. I think that if I can read it and enjoy it, definitely anyone else can do the same. The second expectation that I had talked about was that malazan was going to be all about war. I said in my last video that that wasn't true at all, and that the book was mainly set in one area and it didn't really have a ton of battle scenes. That definitely changes in book 2. Book 2 does have a number of battle scenes, and war campaigning is a really central plot line. So if that's something that you enjoy, it's pretty significant in this book, so you'll probably like that. If you're like me and that's not necessarily your favorite thing to read about, there's still plenty of other things to sink your teeth into, and specifically the magic system gets delved into a little more in this book, and it's still quite mysterious, but you get a little bit more information as to how it works, and you get to see it in action a lot more in this book. I still hesitate to say that malazan is all about war, and I guess this ties in with my next expectation, which was malazan is grimdark. I don't think that the point of malazan is the war itself. When it comes to talking about DEADHOUSE GATES, whether or not it was grimdark, this book was simultaneously darker but also funnier than the last book. So for me, it's hard to quantify how much grim darkiness does it take to call something grimdark. I'm not particularly familiar with the genre, but like my gut reaction is to say that Malazan isn't really grimdark, because yes, there is a lot of war and it is quite central to the plot, but that doesn't seem to be the point. Like, the point is really the people and how they're reacting to this war and the consequences that it has on the people. I looked up where the word grimdark originated from, and it was from this quote from Warhammer 40k, and it says that in the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. I feel like that doesn't totally encapsulate what Malazan is all about. Like I said, I think that the point is always the people and not necessarily the plot. I mean, at the end of the day, it's kind of just like an argument about semantics, like whether or not to label this book as grimdark. It's not a particularly deep argument that I want to engage in, but I do think it's slightly interesting to ponder whether or not Malazan fits into the grimdark category. I will say that this book has quite a bit of content warnings. There is rape in this book, and it's quite significant to one of the characters' storylines. So if that is something that you generally don't like to read about, then this might not be the series for you. That's how I would describe Malazan, as like a value study, you know, like a drawing done in charcoal. Most of the characters just fit into those varying shades of gray, with very few fully evil and very few fully good characters. All right, the fourth expectation / assumption I had made about Malazan in my last video was that Malazan has beautiful prose, and that remains to be true. I think that Gardens of the Moon, I called it poetic, and I think that Deadhouse Gates continued to be beautiful and extremely poetic in the way that Erikson writes. I've noticed in particular that he used the word ochre a lot. Like every time he used the word ochre in this book, take a shot. But yeah, this book was still beautifully written, and even like the scenes that I didn't particularly like, you know, like the battle scenes that I just in general don't like battle scenes, I still found myself paying attention to them and really being able to visualize those battle scenes so well, because Erikson writes with such clarity and accuracy. One thing in particular that I thought this book did exceptionally well was instilling a sense of history, like a deep sense of ancient history to the world of Malazan. I think in the hands of a less skilled author, that might come off artificial, especially with the time frames that Erikson is dealing with, like thousands of years. That is really hard to really impress upon a reader. Like, this is something that has been going on for thousands, tens of thousands of years. Like, to the human mind, it's almost impossible to comprehend, but I think that Erikson does a really good job of selling that. This concept was enforced further by themes of immortality and rebirth, which were continually explored throughout this book. And if you want to talk about something that's unique to Malazan, I would say that it's Erikson's exploration of immortality. I don't think I've ever read an author who has been able to really explore the nuances of immortality and what it would really mean to be alive for that long. Moving on from prose to character, I said that one of my expectations was that Malazan would have weak characters, and I think that if Gardens of the Moon had good characters, I think Deadhouse Gates just took it to the next level. Usually in any sprawling fantasy epic, there's at least a couple POVs that I don't enjoy, but with Deadhouse Gates, I loved every single one. After finishing the book, I definitely think that some were better than others, but while I was reading the book, I was fully invested in every single plot line, and that's really rare. It's not often that I am so fully compelled by a book. Usually, you know, there's a couple characters where I'm like, Something Deadhouse Gates did really well was the secondary characters. Not that Gardens of the Moon did it badly, but I just noticed it a lot more that in this book, even the secondary or tertiary characters were characters that I was interested in. I think a good rule of thumb is that if you could center the book around the secondary characters just as easily as like the primary characters, I think that's a sign of a really well fleshed out novel where it doesn't feel like the world was built up around the main cast. And so those are all of the expectations that I had in my first video. Like I said, some of my opinions have changed, others have stayed the same. But overall, I think that Deadhouse Gates is much easier to read and to get into than Gardens of the Moon. So if you were someone who struggled through the first book and you were like, oh, I don't really know if Malazan is the series for me, I think that Deadhouse Gates will be the decider. Like, if you don't enjoy this, maybe Malazan is just not the series for you, and you know, you can go read all of the millions of other books out there. Personally, I loved Gardens of the Moon. I was sold on the first book, so I'm excited to keep reading, and the rest of the video is going to contain spoilers, so if you haven't read Malazan yet, I will see you in the next video. Thank you so much for watching, and take care. Okay, so if you're still here, I hope that you've read all of Deadhouse Gates at least. I'm gonna be spoiling basically through the ending of book 2. So this is your last chance to click off before I dive into the spoilers. But I just want to say that why does Steven Erikson keep killing my favorite characters? In Gardens of the Moon, I loved Tattersail. She was so awesome, and like, she died. And obviously she comes back in like her weird baby warlock body swapping thing, but like, she still didn't make an appearance in Deadhouse Gates, and I'm really sad. And then in this book, one of my favorite characters, Duiker, ends up dying and dies at the end, and it was just one of the best scenes. I think that if you want to talk about prose in Deadhouse Gates, like, that scene where Duiker dies is just one of the most beautiful, haunting scenes I've ever read in my life, and I literally had to like stop and read it like 2 or 3 times before I went on, because I was just like, what just happened? And just the entire storyline for Duiker. I know I said that I don't like battle scenes, but I still loved reading Duiker's scenes because he himself was such a fascinating character. Another character that I really enjoyed in this book, and it was probably my favorite character, though I'm scared to call her my favorite character because that probably means that Erikson's gonna kill her, but Felisin was a standout for me in this book. And okay, and then finally, I wanted to do like book 3/beyond predictions, like where I think characters are gonna end up and stuff like that. So I think that Apsalar is gonna team up with Felisin. I don't really have a reason for that, except for that I want it to happen. And I think it would be really cool for like Hood and Shaik to like, I don't know, team up and like be a god team. And then I think that Kalam and his girlfriend are gonna use their army of the undead children to like help with the war that's happening back on Genebacus. And that is like something that was really crazy to me, is that even though this huge conflict is happening on this continent, there's still a huge other completely separate conflict that's happening on the continent in Genebacus. And I think that that's like one of the best things about Malazan, is like there's a real sense of scope, and like it just feels like such a big world. So I already started book 3, Memories of Ice. I'm like about a chapter in, I think. Not really. I think I finished the prologue, which was insane and like so crazy. Definitely the best prologue so far. It has been Memories of Ice, but yeah, that is it. This video was super rambly, so if you stuck here till the end, thank you so much for watching my channel and supporting my videos. I'm really excited to read the rest of the Malazan series. It's shaping up to be definitely in my top 10, maybe even in my top 5 fantasy series of all time. So I'm really having a good time with Malazan. So again, thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next video. Take care.